we are joined by musician and 1994 Eurovision winner, Charlie McGettigan. Charlie, you are in favour of some sort of Israeli sanction or Israel not taking part in this year's contest. Tell us why.
Yes, well, I suppose like everybody else, I've seen nightly on our news channels what's going on in Gaza, how the Israeli regime are treating the people of Gaza. I drew an analogy to myself today. It's something like as if during the troubles in Northern Ireland, that the British government decided to bomb Belfast because there were IRA cells there, just literally indiscriminately bombed. Now, you can imagine the uproar there would be if something like that happened. So this is a similar situation. They're using the excuse that there are Hamas cells within Gaza and they just bomb indiscriminately, which I think is, I had a lot of people arguing what is genocide, what isn't genocide. Somebody said it's only genocide if you're knocking on people's doors and taking them out one by one and shooting them, but I think to indiscriminately bombing is a lot worse than that.
So ideally, in your scenario then, would it be that the EBU, the organisers, expel Israel, or do you think that everyone else should boycott it because they ought to be included anyway? Or what would be your best case scenario?
The best case scenario for me would be that if all the countries that are involved in the Eurovision, or a good percentage of them, would show some kind of solidarity with the people of Gaza by either boycotting it or raising the whole issue wherever they can. Even to, we saw Bambi Tug last year. She did her best to sort of highlight how she felt about what was happening in Gaza. Now, I'm not condoning what Hamas are doing either. I'm not more or less saying, as far as I'm concerned, the hostages should be released. I don't absolutely abhor what they did October, whenever it was, not that long ago, where they took Israeli hostages and etc. I'm against all that, of course, as well. Ideally, there would be some kind of a come together for peace, basically.
Charlie, you have some experience of what it's like, the preparation that involves in getting ready for the Eurovision Song Contest. Although, no disrespect to you, I'd imagine it's a lot more elaborate now because of the elaborate staging and everything else that goes into the acts these days. But given how much preparation it takes for an act to qualify for the Eurovision itself and all the rehearsals and everything else that goes on, is it fair to ask the acts for those countries then to withdraw because of a political dispute happening elsewhere?
Well, there's a lot of work goes in it, and it does actually break my heart to have to do this because I've been a Eurovision fan since the 1960s when it was still in black and white. So, I love Eurovision. I think it's a great coming together of people, but it should be a coming together of people, who want justice, who want peace, just some kind of I think we need to make some kind of a protest, either, that we ask the Israelis to withdraw, or insist that they withdraw because of how we feel about what they're doing in Gaza.
Stay with us, Charlie. I wanted to get the thoughts of our panel here in studio this evening. Rory Hearn, actually, before the general election, you ran a marathon trying to raise money and awareness for the plight of people in Gaza. What do you say to the argument that pop and politics shouldn't mix? And although people might have grievances with the Israeli state, this is just an Israeli song performer performing in a song contest, and that we shouldn't make it political.
I think it's a difficult one, but I do think, we're looking at what's happening right now, what we're seeing, genocide unfolding before our eyes. And it's now Israel, is talking about, taking over Gaza, the Gaza Strip, completely occupying it, ethnic cleansing. We're seeing this week the reports, schools where children, families sheltering, being bombed. This is a point where, as UN experts said today, we're at a moral crossroads in terms of what is happening. The prospect is the annihilation of the Palestinian population, the territory. And so in this case, when we're looking at the Eurovision, I know, people in Ireland and across Europe hold the Eurovision, as something very special for all of us. Some people really enjoy it, some people hate it. But I do think that we're at the point where events like these, be they sports events, cultural events, I think it's a very legitimate point to say that politics and protest is going to come into it and it's going to be part of it.
But the participant in the Eurovision, though, is not the Israeli state. It's the Israeli broadcaster, which is editorially independent and which is not itself undertaking an armed campaign in Palestine.
No, it's not. But when you look at what is happening in Gaza, people are trying to, as Charlie talked about, express a protest. And I think that's absolutely right. And that will take many different forms. And one of them is, I think it's reasonable. We saw, Russia being banned, and rightfully, from the Eurovision when they invaded Ukraine. I think the same needs to happen with Israel. Do you know what I mean? They should be banned from the Eurovision, not taking part. There are other issues going on in terms of, cultural, as I said, sports events. We saw, what happened with kneecap. I think, music is political. It's always been political. Sports is, maybe slightly different, but music is such an expression of protest. And I do think that in this, we have to do something. And I think people are right wherever they can to protest, because this is a genocide, it's ethnic cleansing. And we have to say, as a global community, stop.
Who you saw there on screen while Rory was speaking was Yuval Raphael, who is Israel's entry in this year's Eurovision Song Contest. And making the whole thing slightly more complicated is the fact that Yuval herself was attending the Novi Music Festival, which was raided by those Hamas militants on October the 7th. She was able to take shelter, but she saw a lot of her own friends and people that she knew being attacked by Hamas and in some instances being taken hostage. And in circumstances like that, Malcolm Byrne, it makes it more difficult to argue that she should be held as the political face for a government that she doesn't represent.
I think, first of all, there's the broader issue, which, and as the Taoiseach called out the Netanyahu government this week for committing war crimes in terms of the denying of aid to civilians. That is a war crime. That's very clear. And I think any actions that the Irish government should take should be around how we can ensure immediately a ceasefire. Secondly, obviously, we need to look at the hostages being returned. And I think
calling for Israel's expulsion from the Eurovision.
I think I'll come back to that, because I think there are other measures. For instance, Ireland has been very supportive of Ehud Barak, the former Israeli Prime Minister, and Nasser al-Kidra, the former Palestinian Foreign Minister, their efforts at trying to seek peace, because we do need to find a long-term peaceful solution. That's not going to be found with the Netanyahu government or with Hamas. I'm always a little bit cautious of when you start to mix politics with art and culture, or indeed with sport, because the question then is, do you discriminate against the artist who, and Rory's right, music is political, and in many cases you'll often see musicians who oppose and challenge the state. In this case, as you said, with Yuval Raphael, not alone was she, and she lost friends in the Hamas attack on the 7th of October, as she still has shrapnel in her legs from that particular attack. And I didn't know much about her entry, but she's made very clear she's just interested in the music. She doesn't want to be engaged in the politics of all of this. But I do accept this as a question about the Israeli state broadcaster and whether it should be allowed to continue. And I think it is part of that bigger debate around kneecap. Kneecap were overtly political. Kneecap did say things such as that they support for Hamas and Hezbollah, and I defend the right if they wanted to do that, and they subsequently apologised for that. But I wouldn't have supported, people who are saying that they should be banned from Glastonbury and everywhere else as a result of those statements.
But is there a difference between appearing at a festival and then appearing as some sort of auxiliary de facto national representative?
I mean, I get the point. First of all, that they're not, they're representing the Israeli state broadcaster, which is an independent broadcaster. I think it will make it more complex because the Israeli singer was a victim of the Hamas attack. As I say, I've kind of mixed views. It's obviously a matter. Kevin Bakhurst, as Director General of RTE, has raised this at the European Broadcasting Union as something that wants to be discussed. I understand that the Spanish and Slovenian broadcasters have similarly raised the issue. I do think, though, that when you look at cultural and sporting boycotts, and I'm not doubting that they're not effective, you do need to think about the sports people and the artists as well. And you've got to be consistent.
But isn't there a certain amount of, it's almost sanitizing of what is going on? We're witnessing genocide right now. And this is the international community. And we've seen the court ruling in terms of the International Criminal Court of Justice in terms of the ruling around Israel engaging, in war crimes. And there's an obligation and a responsibility on all of us as states, as citizens. And the Eurovision is something where countries are represented. It's beyond just a music event. It is something where national countries are represented.
So you don't really see that distinction between it being a participant of a broadcaster.
I don't.
As actual state representatives.
Yeah, I do. In this instance, and I think there is a point for us making that statement and saying, look, it can't be just business as usual. This is a genocide. It's ongoing. And surely there has to be consequences, just as there was for Russia when it invaded Ukraine.
I'm not disagreeing with you in terms of, Israel's action, the Netanyahu government's actions are pretty appalling. And it may be a case that the EBU may decide not to allow, the Israeli entry to take part. I do think, though, in the context of the debate that's happened around NECAP, we need to be very careful as well, because, I defend NECAP's right to be able to express its own point of view. You've got to remember who the Israeli entry happens to be. She's not representing the Israeli government. She's been a victim of the Hamas attacks. And, I think as Charlie was saying there, the Israeli government and what it is doing is horrific, but that certainly doesn't justify Hamas's actions either. And I think particularly given who the entrant is, I'm agreeing with you that every possible action needs to be taken at an international level, which is what the Taoiseach is doing, because ultimately we've got to keep a focus on how we can achieve the ceasefire, the release of hostages, but in the long term, a peaceful solution in the Middle East.
Gabija Gataveckaite, thanks for holding your tongue. We'll wait for the two lads to thrash that out. We were just remarking, even before we came on air this evening, that it's a very difficult line for RTE to walk, because, for example, I have a statement from the Norwegian public broadcaster in front of me, and they say that if they were to institute a cultural boycott of another participant in the Eurovision, they would lose their credibility as an independent news provider. Given that there's been a lot of scrutiny on RTE's editorial handling of all of this, is this a fight that Kevin Bakhurst shouldn't be picking? Yeah,
I was quite surprised to hear that he penned that letter this morning, calling for this discussion. Like, it is an interesting line for RTE to take, because all we've heard in the past couple of years is a debate around essentially RTE's dealing with finances, its credibility, how open, how honest it has been with the public. And this is an interesting stance, I think, for Kevin Bakhurst to take, to lead the organisation into, because, of course, legally, RTE is obliged to be impartial and to be fair. And I think it particularly comes at a very interesting time, because it's not as if this is the first Eurovision after the October 7th attack and after all of the unrest ramped up in the Middle East. I mean, we already had the Eurovision last year. Of course, Israel participated in that and it was not banned. So this year, the conversation kind of takes in a different context, in that there's already precedent, if you will, as to what happened last year. Also, we know that the EBU was very quick to ban Russia when it invaded Ukraine, and there was pretty much no conversation around that. I mean, that decision was quite immediate.
Apparently on the pretense that Russia's national broadcaster wasn't independent of government, that it was running government editorial control, basically.
Sure. So obviously, if a broadcaster receives state funding, I mean, you can raise your own questions around that when it comes to independence and so on. But I think it is an interesting argument for RTE. Of course, this is something that the union within RTE called for. Emma O'Kelly speaking, saying, there's frequently been, I think, even protests within RTE by staff members around the atrocities in Gaza, and they've been very outspoken around that. But I think it'll be interesting to see how this translates in the coming weeks before the Eurovision airs.
Charlie McGettigan, some of the responses that we're getting on our text line this evening are making the argument that Israel are not the first country that would be participating in the Eurovision that have some objectionable records. Even back in 1994, when you participated, there were some governments whose records were pretty checkered. And they would say that really that we need to be consistent and allow all entrants to take part, even no matter what their governments might be doing.
Yeah, well, I think that what's happening in Gaza is unprecedented. It's not a political thing at all. When you just look at your screen every night and you just see the misery and the hardship, people are now going to dumps try and find food to eat. This is a human crisis. It's not a political thing. It's a human crisis. I mean, to block food supplies and medical supplies going into Gaza, it's unprecedented, and it definitely, as the Taoiseach said, it's war crimes.
Will you be watching the contest this year if Israel is still a participant, mindful that the Israeli entry is in the same semi-final as Ireland, as well as possibly the grand final itself?
Is that for me?
That's for you, Charlie.
Yeah, so it breaks my heart to say that I won't be watching, because I love Eurovision. I think it's a beautiful way of coming together, of people coming together. And what I'm hoping that would happen is that all the participations would show solidarity with the Palestinian people in Gaza by making some kind of protest, making some kind of an argument against what's happening there.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. Charlie McGettigan, winner of the 1994 Eurovision Song Contest, thank you for joining us this evening on The Tonight Show.